The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the courthouse steps as the judge gathered his belongings from his chambers. It had been another demanding day, 7 cases, 2 sentencings, and a particularly challenging custody dispute that had left him emotionally drained. His shoulders felt heavy under his pressed suit, but there was a small smile playing on his lips as he thought about driving home in his new car. The luxury sedan, a sleek charcoal gray Mercedes-Benz, represented 20 years of hard work, from his days as a public defender to his recent appointment to the Superior Court bench. He'd spent months researching before making the purchase, and even now, 3 weeks later, he still caught himself admiring its smooth lines and polished finish. His old Toyota had served him well, but this was his dream car. Walking through the courthouse parking lot, he nodded to the security guard who'd been working there since before he became a judge. "Another late night, Your Honor," the guard called out with a friendly wave. They shared a knowing look. In their line of work, late nights were more common than early exits. As he approached his car, he caught his reflection in the window, a man in his 50s, with gentle eyes behind his wire-rimmed glasses and gray-peppered throughout his short-cropped hair. His mother had always told him to dress the part, and he did. Crisp white shirt, navy blue suit, and the gold watch his father had given him when he passed the bar exam. Settling into the leather seat, he let out a long breath, feeling the day's tension begin to melt away. The car's interior still had that new car smell, mixed with the supple scent of the leather conditioner he'd started using to keep the seats pristine. He placed his judicial robes carefully on the back seat, where they'd hung countless times before in his old car. The engine purred to life with a gentle push of the start button. He still wasn't quite used to that. No key needed, just the fob in his pocket and a touch of a button. It was these little touches of luxury that made him appreciate how far he'd come from the small apartment above his parents' restaurant where he'd grown up. As he pulled out of the parking lot, he decided to take the scenic route home. The suburban streets were quiet at this hour, with just enough traffic to make him feel like he was part of the peaceful flow of evening life. He passed the park where he sometimes spent his lunch breaks, watching families and dog walkers enjoy the green space. The local coffee shop where he grabbed his morning brew was closing up for the day, its baristas wiping down windows and stacking chairs. The car's navigation system softly guided him through familiar turns, though he hardly needed it. He'd driven these streets for years, watching the neighborhoods change and grow. Past the elementary school where he sometimes spoke to students about the law, beyond the row of small businesses he'd seen flourish and fade, and through the intersection where he'd first learned to drive in his father's old Buick. He turned on the radio, keeping the volume low, a jazz station playing Miles Davis. The music fit perfectly with the golden hour light streaming through his windows. His thoughts drifted to the weekend ahead. His nephew's basketball game, dinner with his sister and her family, maybe some time in his small vegetable garden if the weather held up. The road curved gently ahead, lined with maple trees just starting to show their spring buds. He'd chosen this route home specifically for moments like this, when the day's weight could be shed slowly, deliberately, with each passing mile. The sedan handled the curves with graceful ease, almost anticipating his gentle guidance of the wheel. In his rearview mirror, the sunset painted the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, a perfect end to a long day. He was looking forward to getting home, changing into comfortable clothes, and maybe catching up on that novel sitting on his nightstand. Simple pleasures, but ones he'd learned to cherish after years of working late nights as a young lawyer. The neighborhood streets were growing familiar now, just a few miles from home. He passed Mrs. Chen's flower shop, closed for the day but still bright with potted spring blooms, and the hardware store where he bought supplies for his weekend projects. Each landmark was a reminder that he was almost home, almost able to fully relax into his evening routine. Little did he know that this peaceful drive, this moment of quiet reflection, was about to be interrupted in a way that would change not just his evening, but the conversations and consciousness of an entire community. For now, though, he was simply a man driving home after a long day's work, enjoying the simple pleasure of a quiet moment in a beautiful car. A moment of peace before the storm that was about to break. The peaceful evening drive came to an abrupt end when flashing lights filled the judge's rearview mirror. At first, they seemed distant, and he automatically moved toward the right lane to let the police car pass. but the lights grew brighter and the siren gave 2 short bursts, the universal signal that he was the one being pulled over. His heart rate quickened, not from guilt, but from instinct. Even for a judge who had spent decades in the legal system, being stopped by police stirred something primal. He did everything by the book. Right turn signal on, slowly pulling to the curb, hands visible on the steering wheel at 10 and 2. The luxury car's engine hummed quietly as he put it in park. Through his side mirror, he watched the police cruiser stop about 20 feet behind him. The officer didn't immediately get out. Instead, he could see him speaking into his radio, the blue and red lights casting dancing shadows across the residential street. Neighbors' curtains twitched with curiosity. A police stop wasn't common in this quiet suburb. The judge took slow, deliberate breaths. He'd given talks to young people about exactly this situation. Stay calm, be respectful, move slowly. Now it was his turn to practice what he preached. His judicial ID was in his wallet, and the car's registration and insurance were in the glove compartment. He waited, hands still on the wheel, as footsteps approached his car. The officer appeared in his side mirror, hand resting near his holster, a detail that didn't escape the judge's notice. The flashlight beam swept across his rear window, lingering on the judicial robes hanging in the back seat before moving to illuminate the car's interior. Evening, the officer called out, his voice carrying an edge of tension. "I'm Officer Thompson with the County Police Department. We've had reports of a vehicle matching this description stolen from the dealership on Madison Avenue. I need to see your license, registration, and proof of insurance." The judge kept his hands visible as he spoke. "Officer, I want to inform you that I'm going to reach for my wallet in my back pocket, and then I'll need to access the glove compartment for the other documents." His voice was steady, professional, the same tone he used in his courtroom. "Proceed slowly," the officer instructed, the flashlight beam unwavering. As the judge reached for his wallet, he noticed a second patrol car pulling up. His chest tightened. This was escalating quickly. He'd bought this car 3 weeks ago, had all the paperwork, but somehow he knew this wasn't going to be a routine traffic stop. The cool evening air carried the sound of radio static and murmured conversations between the officers. More lights now, creating a light show that would draw every neighbor's attention. The judge could feel eyes on him from the surrounding homes, could imagine the conversations starting behind those lit windows. He carefully extracted his wallet, movements deliberately slow and smooth. "Officer, I want you to know that I'm a superior court judge. My judicial ID is in here along with my driver's license." The words came out calm, but he could feel his pulse in his temples. The flashlight beam intensified. "Sir, I'm going to need you to keep your hands where I can see them and step out of the vehicle." The officer's tone had shifted, carrying a note of disbelief that made the judge's stomach sink. 20 years on the bench, countless cases heard, laws interpreted, justice dispensed, and here he sat, being treated like a car thief. The irony wasn't lost on him. Just that morning, he presided over a case involving racial profiling, and now he complied with the order, moving with the same measured patience he counseled others to use. The door handle felt cool under his fingers as he pulled it, the car's interior light casting a soft glow. As he began to step out, he could see the second officer approaching, hand also near his weapon. The evening had transformed from a peaceful drive home into something else entirely, a moment that would soon spark conversations far beyond this quiet suburban street. The judge knew that how he handled the next few minutes would matter, not just for him, but for the broader dialogue about law enforcement and community relations. Street lights buzzed overhead, insects danced around their glow, and somewhere in the distance, a dog barked at the commotion. Just another evening in America where a dream car could turn into a nightmare, where success didn't shield you from suspicion, and where the line between enforcing the law and abusing authority often blurred into that gray space where prejudice lived. Standing there in his suit, hands raised slightly at his sides, the judge felt the weight of the moment. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about every person who'd ever been wrongly suspected, every assumption made based on appearance, and every opportunity to either widen or heal the divide between law enforcement and the community they served. The red and blue lights kept flashing, casting alternating shadows across the faces of everyone involved, while the next chapter of this story was about to unfold on this otherwise ordinary suburban street. Standing under the harsh glare of police spotlights, the judge maintained his composure despite the growing tension in the air. His suit, which had felt comfortable in his chambers just an hour ago, now seemed to cling uncomfortably in the cool evening breeze. The neighbors had given up any pretense of discretion. Several had come out onto their porches to watch the scene unfold. "Sir, do you have any proof of ownership for this vehicle?" Officer Thompson's voice carried across the space between them, sharp and demanding. The second officer had positioned himself slightly to the side, creating a tactical angle that the judge recognized from countless courtroom testimonies about police procedures. "Yes, I do," the judge replied, his voice steady but firm. "All the documentation is in my glove compartment, as I mentioned. The bill of sale, registration, insurance, everything. I purchased this car 3 weeks ago from the dealership on Oak Street, not Madison Avenue." The officer's flashlight beam swept across him again. "That's not what I asked. Do you have proof of ownership on you right now?" The emphasis on right now carried an edge of skepticism that made the judge's jaw tighten. A third patrol car pulled up, its lights adding to the disco-like atmosphere that had transformed this quiet street into what looked like a major crime scene. The judge could hear the whispers from the growing crowd of onlookers, could feel the weight of their stares. "Officer," he began again, drawing on decades of courtroom experience to keep his voice level, "I am judge," but before he could finish, he was cut off. "Sir, being a judge doesn't give you the right to ignore direct questions," the officer interrupted, his hand still hovering near his weapon. "We have reports of a stolen vehicle matching this exact description. Your cooperation would make this go a lot smoother." The irony of the situation wasn't lost on the judge. Just that morning, he presided over a case where he lectured about the importance of proper police procedure and respect for civil rights. Now here he stood, experiencing firsthand what so many had testified about in his courtroom. "I understand you're doing your job," the judge responded, maintaining his diplomatic tone. "I'm simply trying to explain that I can prove both my identity and ownership of this vehicle if you'll allow me to access my documents. Would you prefer to retrieve them yourself with my guidance?" A small group of teenagers had gathered on the corner, phones out, recording everything. The judge knew this scene would likely be on social media within minutes. He thought about his position in the community, about the young law clerks who looked up to him, about his responsibility to handle this situation in a way that might create positive change. The second officer stepped forward. "We're going to need to verify the VIN number against our database. Stand facing your vehicle, hands where we can see them." The command was delivered in a tone that suggested non-compliance wasn't an option. As the judge complied, placing his hands on his car's roof, he felt the cool nettle under his palms. The same car he'd been so proud to purchase, that had represented years of hard work and achievement, now felt like a trap. He could hear the officers discussing something behind him, their radios crackling with dispatcher responses. An older couple walking their dog passed by, slowing to stare at the scene. The judge recognized them from community meetings. They'd always been vocal about supporting law enforcement. Now they watched with uncertain expressions as their local judge was being treated like a common criminal. The dealership on Madison reported a gray Mercedes matching this description stolen just this afternoon, Officer Thompson announced, reading from his phone. "They say it was taken during a test drive." The judge took a deep breath. "Officer, I understand the similarity is concerning, but I can assure you this is a misunderstanding. If you'll check the VIN number against the registration in my glove compartment, you'll see this car was purchased from a completely different dealership 3 weeks ago." A younger officer who had just arrived whispered something to Officer Thompson, whose posture shifted slightly. The judge couldn't hear what was said, but he noticed a subtle change in the atmosphere. Perhaps someone had finally recognized him, or maybe his story was being verified through official channels. The minutes stretched on, feeling like hours. The judge remained still, his mind racing through every case he'd heard involving similar situations, every testimony about racial profiling, every community meeting where these issues had been discussed. He thought about how this moment could be used to bridge gaps rather than widen them. More cars had slowed as they passed the scene, some even pulling over to watch. The judge could only imagine the stories that would spread through the courthouse tomorrow. But right now, he focused on breathing steadily, on staying calm, on being the example he always tried to be from the bench. This wasn't just about him anymore. It had become something larger, a moment that would either reinforce stereotypes or help break them down. As he stood there, hands still planted firmly on his car's roof, he knew that how this situation resolved would matter far beyond this evening, far beyond this street corner, and far beyond his own experience. The red and blue lights continued their rhythmic dance across the houses and faces of onlookers, while behind him, the officers conferred in low voices about what would happen next. The night air had grown cooler, but the tension remained thick and warm, like a heavy blanket over the entire scene. The turning point came with the squeal of tires as another vehicle pulled up to the scene. This time, it wasn't a patrol car, but an unmarked police vehicle. A senior officer stepped out, his face changing from concern to recognition as he surveyed the scene. The judge knew him. They'd worked together on numerous cases over the years. "Hold on," the senior officer called out, walking briskly toward the group. "I know this man. He's our superior court judge." His voice carried the weight of authority that comes with rank and experience. The atmosphere shifted palpably. Officer Thompson's posture changed, though his flashlight remained steady. "Sir, we still need to verify the vehicle's ownership. We have a reported theft that matches this description." "Then let's verify it properly," the senior officer replied, turning to the judge. "Your Honor, with your permission, may we check the documentation in your glove compartment?" Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the judge was allowed to lower his hands from the car's roof. "Of course," he replied, maintaining his dignified demeanor despite the situation. "The paperwork is exactly where I said it was 20 minutes ago." Under the watchful eyes of the gathered crowd, Officer Thompson carefully opened the passenger door and retrieved the documents. The clicking of phone cameras continued from the sidewalk, where the audience had grown considerably. Some people were live streaming the entire incident. The senior officer examined the paperwork under the harsh beam of a flashlight. The registration matched. The insurance card matched. The bill of sale clearly showed a purchase date from 3 weeks ago, from a completely different dealership than the one reporting the theft. "The VIN number matches the registration," Officer Thompson announced, his voice noticeably less confident now. He'd moved to the front of the car to verify the number against the documentation. A dispatcher's voice crackled over the radio, confirming what they'd just discovered. The stolen vehicle report was for a similar model, but from a different year, with a different VIN number. The pieces of the puzzle were finally falling into place, revealing a picture very different from what the officers had initially assumed. The judge stood quietly, watching as realization dawned on the faces of the officers. His judicial robes still hung in the back seat, a silent testament to his identity that had been visible from the very beginning. The same robes he'd worn earlier that day while presiding over cases, perhaps even cases involving some of these very officers. The senior officer handed the documents back to the judge with visible embarrassment. "Your Honor, I apologize for this incident. There was clearly a misunderstanding." His words seemed to hang in the air, inadequate against the backdrop of what had just transpired. Officer Thompson stepped forward, his earlier assertiveness replaced with evident discomfort. "Sir, I apologize for the inconvenience. We were following up on a reported theft." His voice trailed off as he realized how weak the explanation sounded. The judge accepted the documents, carefully organizing them before speaking. The crowd on the sidewalk had grown silent, straining to hear what he would say. Even the night insects seemed to have hushed their chirping. "I understand you were doing your job," the judge began, his voice carrying clearly through the evening air. "But I hope you understand why this situation is particularly troubling." He gestured to his car, his suit, his judicial ID that had been ignored. "Everything I told you from the beginning was true. Every attempt I made to explain was dismissed." The red and blue lights still pulsed silently, creating an odd theatrical effect as the judge continued. "This isn't just about me. It's about every person who gets pulled over and isn't wearing a suit, doesn't have a judicial ID, doesn't have someone in authority who can vouch for them." Some of the neighbors who had been watching nodded in agreement. Others looked uncomfortable, perhaps seeing for the first time how quickly assumptions could escalate a situation. The teenagers with their phones had gone quiet, but their cameras were still rolling. The senior officer took charge of the situation. "We'll need to file a full report about this incident," he said, looking at each of the officers present. "And I believe we owe His Honor more than just a verbal apology." The judge checked his watch. Nearly an hour had passed since he'd first seen those flashing lights in his mirror. An hour that had transformed a routine traffic stop into something that would likely be discussed in community meetings and police training sessions for months to come. As the officers began to disperse and the patrol cars started pulling away, the judge stood for a moment by his car. The same car that had brought him such joy just hours ago had become the catalyst for a crucial conversation about assumptions, authority, and the need for change. The crowd slowly dispersed, but their phones had captured everything. By morning, this incident would be more than just a personal experience. It would be a talking point, a teaching moment, perhaps even a catalyst for change in how law enforcement approached similar situations in the future. The night air had grown cooler, and the judge could finally feel his heart rate returning to normal. As he prepared to continue his drive home, he knew this evening would stay with him, not just as a personal ordeal, but as a reminder of why his role in the justice system was so important. By sunrise the next morning, video clips of the incident had spread across social media like wildfire. The judge's phone buzzed continuously with messages from concerned colleagues, community leaders, and local news outlets. What had started as a personal ordeal was rapidly transforming into a citywide conversation about law enforcement practices and racial bias. Walking into the courthouse that morning felt different. The usual morning buzz was replaced with hushed conversations that stopped when he passed. Court officers who normally gave him a simple nod now approached with words of support and concern. His secretary had already fielded dozens of calls from reporters seeking comment. "The video has over 100,000 views," one of his younger law clerks informed him, tablet in hand. The footage, shot by those teenagers on the street corner, showed everything in stark detail: his calm demeanor, the officer's aggressive stance, the revelation of his identity. Comments beneath the videos ranged from outrage to defensive justifications of police procedure. During his morning calendar, he noticed more people than usual sitting in on routine hearings. Local reporters tried to blend in with the regular courthouse crowd, their notebooks ready. Even the attorneys appearing before him seemed more careful with their words, more aware of the weight of the moment. At lunch, he received a call from the chief of police requesting a meeting. "This incident has raised serious concerns," the chief admitted, his voice carrying the strain of someone dealing with an unwanted spotlight. "We need to address this head-on." The judge's colleague from the next courtroom stopped by his chambers. "You know, something similar happened to my son last month," she shared. "But he doesn't wear a judge's robe or drive a Mercedes. He was just a young man in a hoodie, driving home from college." Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Community organizations began calling for town hall meetings. Local civil rights groups wanted him to speak at their events. The police department's internal affairs division launched a formal investigation. Each development added another layer to a story that was quickly becoming bigger than one traffic stop on one suburban street. The courthouse security guard who'd wished him good night before the incident now had something different to say. "My grandson saw that video, Your Honor. He asked me why they treated a judge like that. I didn't know what to tell him." The guard's eyes held a mixture of sadness and understanding that spoke volumes. By afternoon, the local news had picked up the story. Headlines read, "Superior Court Judge Profiled in Traffic Stop," and "Judicial Roads No Shield Against Bias." The judge watched as clips from the previous night played on the break room television, seeing himself standing with his hands on his car while officers questioned his identity. His phone buzzed again, this time a message from the Bar Association president. They wanted him to speak at next month's meeting about the incident. "Your perspective as both a judge and a citizen could help bridge some gaps," the message read. The judge pondered how to address this invitation, knowing his words would carry weight in both legal and community circles. During his afternoon session, he presided over a case involving a traffic stop. The irony wasn't lost on anyone in the courtroom. The defending attorney seemed especially passionate, his arguments echoing with the fresh context of recent events. The judge maintained his impartial demeanor, but the previous night's experience added new depth to his understanding of the testimony. As evening approached, he received an unexpected visit from one of the senior police officers who had been at the scene. The department is reviewing our training procedures, the officer explained. We'd appreciate your input on how to prevent situations like this. The conversation that followed was honest, sometimes uncomfortable, but necessary. The day ended with a community meeting hastily organized by local leaders. The courthouse's largest conference room was packed. People from all walks of life came to share their stories, their fears, their hopes for change. The judge listened more than he spoke, understanding that his experience had opened a door for others to voice their own encounters. Outside his office window, news vans had started gathering, their satellite dishes reaching up into the darkening sky. Social media continued to buzz with commentary and debate. What happened to him was becoming a catalyst for larger discussions about law enforcement, racial profiling, and the complex relationship between authority and identity. Before leaving for home, he paused to look at his judicial robe hanging on its usual hook. The simple black garment represented the justice system he had served for decades. Yet last night had shown him that sometimes justice needed to be examined and adjusted, even by those who wore its symbols. The drive home that evening felt different. Each passing police car carried new meaning. Each traffic light held him a moment longer in reflection. The same streets he traveled countless times now told a different story, one that was still being written, not just by him, but by an entire community grappling with difficult truths and the hope for positive change. A week after the incident, the judge sat in his office, looking at the pile of letters and emails that had flooded in from across the country. Each message told a similar story. People sharing their own experiences, thanking him for bringing attention to an issue that had long simmered beneath the surface of their communities. Rather than filing a formal complaint against the officers involved, he had made a different choice. This morning, he was preparing for a meeting that could change how police and community interactions happened in their city. The chief of police had agreed to his proposal, a comprehensive training program that would bring together law enforcement officers and community members. "We've got the conference room set up," his assistant told him, poking her head through the door. Everyone's starting to arrive. The judge gathered his notes, straightened his tie, and took a deep breath. This wasn't going to be an easy conversation, but it was a necessary one. Walking into the conference room, he saw faces from both sides of the issue. Police officers sat somewhat stiffly in their chairs, some in uniform, others in civilian clothes. Community leaders occupied the other side of the room, their expressions a mixture of hope and skepticism. The tension was palpable. "Thank you all for coming," the judge began, his voice carrying the same authority it did in his courtroom. "What happened to me last week was unfortunate, but it's given us an opportunity. An opportunity to do better, to be better, and to make real change in our community." Officer Thompson was there, looking uncomfortable but present. The judge had specifically requested his attendance. The officer who had stopped him that night needed to be part of the solution. Their eyes met briefly across the room, an unspoken acknowledgement passing between them. The judge clicked to his first slide, showing statistics about traffic stops in their city. "These numbers tell a story," he explained. "But behind each number is a person, a family, a life being impacted. I was lucky. I had a position of authority to fall back on. Many others don't." As the morning progressed, people began to open up. A veteran officer shared his perspective on the fears and pressures they faced during traffic stops. A community activist spoke about the trauma of being constantly viewed with suspicion. The conversation wasn't always easy, but it was real. During the lunch break, something unexpected happened. Officer Thompson approached the judge, away from the crowd. "Your Honor," he began, his voice slightly shaky, "I've been doing this job for 12 years. That night, it made me question everything I thought I knew about doing my job right." The judge listened as the officer continued, "I have 3 kids at home. I want them to trust the police to know we're here to help. But after what happened, I realized I might be part of the problem without even knowing it." The honesty in his voice was unmistakable. The afternoon session focused on practical changes. The judge had worked with experts to develop new training protocols. Role-playing exercises were introduced, with officers and community members switching roles to understand each other's perspectives. The discomfort was obvious, but so was the learning. A young officer raised her hand during one session. "But how do we stay safe while also making sure we're not profiling?" Her question cut to the heart of the matter. The room grew quiet, waiting for the judge's response. Safety and respect aren't mutually exclusive, he answered thoughtfully. We can maintain professional caution while treating every person with dignity. That night, I wasn't arguing against being stopped. I was arguing against being dismissed when I tried to explain who I was. As the day went on, more stories emerged. A retired officer admitted to realizing his own biases over the years. A community leader shared positive experiences with police that could serve as models. Slowly, the invisible wall between the two sides began to crack. The judge introduced a new initiative, regular ride-alongs where community leaders would partner with police officers, seeing firsthand the challenges they face. In return, officers would attend community events, meeting people in non-enforcement situations. By late afternoon, small groups had formed, mixing officers and community members, discussing specific issues in their neighborhoods. The energy had shifted from tension to cautious hope. Plans were being made, connections were being formed. This is just the beginning, the judge reminded everyone as the session ended. Real change takes time, commitment, and honesty from all sides. What happened to me was one incident, but it exposed issues we can't ignore anymore. As people filed out, he noticed Officer Thompson deep in conversation with one of the community leaders. They were exchanging phone numbers, planning to continue their discussion. Small steps, but important ones. The evening news would cover the meeting, but they couldn't capture the real story. The subtle shifts in understanding, the quiet moments of recognition, the first tentative steps toward genuine change. The judge knew this was just the start of a longer journey, but looking around the room, he felt hopeful. This wasn't about placing blame or seeking punishment. It was about growth, understanding, and the slow, careful work of building bridges between people who had viewed each other with suspicion for too long. The incident that had started it all was becoming something more, a catalyst for positive change in a community ready for it. 6 months had passed since that fateful night, and the community gathering at the city hall reflected how much had changed. The large meeting room was packed with faces from every part of the city, police officers, community members, local leaders, and media representatives. The judge stood at the podium, looking out at the crowd he'd helped bring together. The changes weren't just visible in the mixed crowd. They could be seen in the statistics projected on the screen behind him, traffic stop numbers showing more equitable treatment, community satisfaction surveys trending upward, and most importantly, increased trust between law enforcement and residents. When I was stopped that night, the judge began, his voice carrying across the hushed room, I never imagined it would lead to this. Sometimes the most difficult moments in our lives become the most important ones. He paused, looking at familiar faces in the audience. Officer Thompson sat in the front row, now serving as one of the lead trainers in the new community engagement program. The change in him over the past months had been remarkable. He transformed from a defensive officer into someone who actively worked to bridge gaps between police and the public. Last week, I watched one of our training sessions, the judge continued. I saw officers and community members talking openly about their fears, their hopes, and their shared desire for a safer community. That kind of honest dialogue wasn't happening 6 months ago. The screen showed photos from recent community events, police officers playing basketball with local kids, community meetings where people actually smiled and talked freely with law enforcement, ride-along programs that had become surprisingly popular. Small changes, but meaningful ones. A young police recruit raised her hand during the question period. How do you balance maintaining authority with building trust? She asked, echoing concerns that many officers still struggled with. The judge smiled, remembering similar questions from months ago. Authority doesn't come from fear or force, he explained. Real authority comes from respect, and respect has to go both ways. When I was stopped that night, both my authority and my dignity were questioned. We're learning now that we can maintain professional caution while preserving human dignity. The local news crews filmed as community leaders shared their experiences. One elderly resident spoke about how officers now regularly stopped by her neighborhood coffee shop, not to patrol, but to chat with locals. Now, when we see a police car, she said, her voice shaking slightly, we don't automatically assume something's wrong. The changes weren't just happening on the streets. The courthouse had implemented new training programs for all staff, from judges to security officers. Cases involving police interactions were handled with new insight, informed by the perspectives gained over the past months. Officer Thompson stood to share his story. "That night changed me," he admitted openly. "I thought I was doing my job right, but I wasn't seeing the whole picture. Now, every traffic stop, every interaction, I remember that everyone has a story, everyone deserves respect." The judge watched as heads nodded throughout the room. The incident that had left him standing with his hands on his car that night had become more than just another story about profiling. It had become a catalyst for real change. "We're not perfect," the judge acknowledged near the end of his speech. "We still have work to do. But look around this room. 6 months ago, many of us wouldn't have been comfortable sitting together, let alone working together for change." The statistics told part of the story: complaints down, positive interactions up, improved response times because people were more willing to cooperate with officers they trusted. But the real story was in the small moments. The handshakes between former adversaries, the conversations happening in coffee shops and community centers, the gradual dissolution of us versus them thinking. As the meeting wrapped up, people lingered, talking in mixed groups. The judge watched as a senior officer gave his car to a community activist, making plans for future collaborations. These were the moments that mattered, the small bridges being built person by person, day by day. Outside, the evening was cooling into dusk. The judge walked to his car, the same Mercedes that had been at the center of everything 6 months ago. But now, when he passed patrol cars, there were often waves of recognition, not suspicion. It wasn't just about him anymore, it was about every person who drove these streets. The local kids who had filmed the original incident were now part of a youth advisory council, working with police to help them understand young people's perspectives. Their phones still recorded police interactions, but now they also captured positive moments, building a new narrative of community relations. As he drove home that evening, the judge reflected on how a moment of injustice had led to months of positive change. The road ahead still had its challenges, but the direction was clear. Sometimes, he thought, the worst moments can lead to the best changes if we're brave enough to learn from them and willing to work together for something better.